I was wrong about dating a sorority girl. I met Claire during the first week of the semester, which in hindsight already feels like a warning sign I ignored on purpose. That week has a strange energy on campus. Everyone is trying to become someone new, and everyone is pretending they aren't scared of disappearing into the background. Claire didn't pretend. She stood out without trying, and she did it quietly. She wasn't loud or performative. She didn't announce herself the way a lot of people do when they want to be noticed. She smiled at people as if she already knew them, even when she didn't, and somehow that made them want to know her back. When she laughed, it wasn't sharp or practiced. It was soft, like she wasn't expecting anyone else to hear it. Claire was already living in the sorority house when we met. I didn't know that at first. I just knew she had a schedule that revolved around obligations she never fully explained. She was always apologizing for being late, always rushing off afterward, and always carrying the weight of something she refused to name. At first, I assumed it was just college, the normal chaos of being 19 and overcommitted. The first crack in the illusion came when I walked her back to the house one night. The building itself was exactly what you'd expect. Big, old, and carefully maintained in a way that felt more like preservation than comfort. The porch lights were on, even though it was late. The windows glowed warmly. From the outside, it looked safe and inviting, like a place designed to convince parents their daughters were protected. Claire slowed as we approached the steps. She didn't say anything, but her posture changed and her shoulders tightened. Her hand slipped out of mine like it had been burned. She smiled anyway. That was the first thing I learned about Claire. She smiled when she was afraid. Inside, the house smelled like perfume and cleaning products layered on top of something older. The walls were covered in framed photos of smiling groups of women, arms linked, heads tilted together, all wearing the same kind of confidence. I noticed immediately that Claire was missing from most of the recent ones. A group of girls sat in the common area, scrolling through their phones, laughing softly. When Claire walked past them, the laughter shifted. It didn't stop. It redirected. No one greeted her. No one acknowledged her presence. She kept her head down and moved faster. I stood there for a second too long, trying to understand what I was seeing without context. When she reached the staircase, she finally looked back. At me, still smiling, still pretending everything was normal. She told me she'd text later, but she didn't. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing patterns I couldn't unsee. Claire's schedule revolved less around classes and more around obligations that appeared without warning. Mandatory meetings. That ran late. Tasks assigned at the last minute. Responsibilities that somehow always fell on her. She stopped wearing certain clothes. Not because of the weather, but because of comments that had been disguised as jokes. Guidance offered with a smile sharp enough to draw blood. Her confidence didn't disappear all at once. It eroded slowly, like someone knew exactly how much to take without making it obvious. I learned the name of the sorority president without being told. Everyone knew her name. She didn't have to raise her voice. She didn't have to be openly cruel. She ruled through implication, through silence, and through the careful distribution of approval. Claire existed outside of that approval. It became clear that she was being punished, though no one ever said what for. The house ran on hierarchy, and Claire was near the bottom. Not invisible, but close enough that no one risked being seen defending her. The other girls didn't have to be mean. All they had to do was comply. I asked Claire once if everything was okay. She said yes too quickly. That was the second thing I learned about her. She believed that if she endured quietly enough, it would eventually stop. I didn't understand yet how wrong that belief was. By the middle of the semester, Claire was sleeping less and apologizing more. She apologized for things that weren't her fault and things that didn't require an apology at all. She apologized for being tired, for being stressed, and even for being quiet. The sorority house had rules that weren't written anywhere. They were rules that changed depending on who they benefited. Claire seemed to be the only one expected to follow all of them. She was assigned cleanup duties after events she didn't attend. She was blamed for scheduling mistakes she hadn't made. She was spoken about in meetings as if she weren't sitting in the room. I started waiting for her outside the house more often, just so she wouldn't have to walk alone. When she came out, she always looked like she was bracing herself for impact, like she'd just survived something she couldn't explain without sounding dramatic. The house took from her constantly, her time, energy, and her confidence, and it gave her nothing in return except the vague promise that things would get better if she just tried harder. I watched her try. She volunteered for everything. She followed every rule. She smiled through every slight. She believed that if she could just prove her worth, the punishment would end. Instead, it escalated. Her name began appearing on group messages she wasn't included in. She was reprimanded for missing information she'd never received. Her belongings went missing and reappeared in places designed to humiliate her. Still, she said nothing. The sorority president never addressed Claire directly. She set the tone and everyone else enforced it. That was how power worked in that house. One night, Claire sat on my bed and stared at the wall for a long time. She didn't cry. She didn't rant. She just looked exhausted in a way that scared me. She told me she was thinking about quitting the sorority. Then she told me why she couldn't. Her housing depended on it. Her scholarship connections depended on it. Her academic recommendations depended on it. Everything was tangled together, in a system designed to make leaving feel impossible. That was when I realized this wasn't just bullying. It was entrapment. The sorority sold itself as a support network. In reality, it functioned like a closed ecosystem. Reputation mattered. More than truth, unity mattered more than fairness. And anyone who threatened the image became expendable. Claire wasn't weak. She was isolated. I wanted to intervene. I wanted to confront someone, anyone, but every path I considered ended the same way, with Claire facing retaliation alone. That was the final layer of the cruelty. They made sure anyone who cared about her was powerless to help. I watched the person I cared about shrink under a system that thrived on quiet suffering, and I realized that whatever this story was going to become, it wasn't going to end gently. The first time Claire missed a class, she didn't tell anyone, not me, not her professors, not even herself, really. She treated it like an anomaly, something that had happened to her rather than a choice she'd made. She framed it as an accident, caused by exhaustion and by a schedule she couldn't control. Then it happened again and again. The sorority's demands were no longer confined to evenings or weekends. They bled into everything. Early morning meetings announced late at night, mandatory attendance requirements for events that conflicted with classes. Responsibilities framed as opportunities but enforced like punishments. Claire stopped arguing with reality. She adapted to it instead. She carried color-coded planners and reminder apps that never seemed to catch up. She drank more caffeine than food. She learned how to exist in a constant state of apology without breaking eye contact. I noticed the way she flinched when her phone buzzed. She'd read messages and nod to herself, already resigning herself to whatever was being asked. Sometimes she wouldn't even tell me where she was going. She didn't want to explain it anymore. The sorority president had perfected a strategy that was almost admirable in its efficiency. She never gave Claire enough to formally complain about. Every infraction was small, every humiliation subtle, every punishment framed as correction. Taken individually, none of it sounded severe. Taken together, it was suffocating. There was an event late in the semester that Claire had been preparing for weeks. She wasn't in charge of it, but she'd been assigned most of the actual labor and coordination with vendors she'd never been introduced to properly. The day of the event, something went wrong. A delivery delay due to a scheduling issue on their end. Nothing catastrophic, but Claire was blamed for all of it. Behind closed doors in a meeting where she was outnumbered, and exhausted and already conditioned to accept fault. She came to my place afterward and sat on the floor instead of the couch. She didn't say anything for a long time. She just stared at her hands like they belonged to someone else. That was the night she stopped defending the sorority. She stopped, saying they were just stressed. That leadership was hard and misunderstandings happened. Something in her finally snapped, but instead of anger, it produced numbness. The retaliation escalated after that. Her access to shared resources was limited. She was excluded from important communications and then reprimanded for being uninformed. Her social standing within the house dropped so quickly it felt intentional, like someone had flipped a switch. Other girls stopped making eye contact with her entirely. She became a liability. The final straw came in the form of a rumor. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't scandalous. That was the genius of it. It was just believable enough to spread quietly and damaging enough to isolate her further. A suggestion that Claire was unreliable, that she struggled emotionally and she wasn't handling college well. Concern masquerading as care. The administration didn't intervene. The sorority handled it internally, which meant the same people. Causing the harm were now responsible for addressing it. Claire was placed on something they called a performance improvement plan. It meant probation without saying the word. She was told it was for her own good. By then, she barely reacted. Realized with a sick clarity that the house wasn't trying to punish her anymore. They were trying to erase her credibility, to rewrite her narrative so that when she finally broke, it would look inevitable. That was the moment I understood the real danger. Not that Claire would leave, but that she would stay long enough to disappear. Claire became smaller in ways that had nothing to do with her body. She took up less space in rooms. She spoke more quietly. She stopped correcting people when they got things wrong about her. It was easier to let the story be told without her participation than to fight it and lose again. Her academic work suffered, not because she wasn't capable, but because she was constantly being interrupted. Deadlines were missed not from laziness, but from exhaustion so deep it felt physical. Sleep became optional. Rest became indulgent. The sorority house continued to operate as if nothing was wrong. Events were held and photos were posted. Claire existed on the edges of these moments, present but absent, included but invisible. The performance improvement plan turned into a tool for control. Every action she took was scrutinized and every success minimized. She started asking permission for things she didn't need permission for. That's when I knew this had crossed into something dangerous. I tried again to find a way out for her. Housing alternatives, academic advisors, and quiet inquiries that wouldn't trigger retaliation. Everything led back to the same obstacle: reputation. The sorority had already planted the narrative. If Claire spoke up now, she wouldn't be a victim. She'd be seen as unstable. The system was airtight, until it wasn't. What the sorority didn't account for was how much evidence they'd created in their effort to remain subtle. Claire kept track of all the emails, messages, and disciplinary notes that contradicted each other. They assumed no one would ever line them up side by side. They assumed Claire was alone. I helped Claire document everything she could remember, even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt. Dates blurred together, but patterns didn't. We gathered enough to see the shape of it, enough to prove intent. The turning point wasn't explosive. It was administrative. A complaint filed through the proper channels, supporting documentation attached. No accusations that couldn't be proven, no emotion that could be dismissed. Claire didn't frame herself as a victim. She framed herself as a liability risk to the institution if the behavior continued unchecked. That's what finally cracked the system. The investigation that followed was quiet, but thorough. The sorority leadership was asked questions they couldn't answer consistently. Their internal records betrayed them and their silence worked against them. Claire was removed from probation quietly, then publicly, though it was framed as a misunderstanding rather than wrongdoing. The president stepped down before the investigation concluded. Others followed soon after. The house didn't collapse. Systems like that rarely do, but it was forced to change enough to expose what it had been hiding. Claire moved out at the end of the semester and didn't look back. After Claire left the sorority house, the quiet was almost shocking. The air she breathed felt different, as though it had been filtered over months of suffocating expectations. For the first time in months, she didn't have to check a calendar. Constantly, didn't have to apologize for her existence, didn't have to explain herself to anyone she didn't trust. Even small routines had been governed by the house. Now she could decide, but freedom brought a strange kind of exhaustion. The weight she had carried didn't vanish instantly. It had settled in her bones, her posture, even her breathing. Flinches still came at unexpected moments. Involuntary reactions to phones buzzing, doors opening too quickly, strangers' glances that reminded her of scrutiny. She had learned to survive in a system designed to erode confidence and unlearning. That survival instinct wasn't easy. We spent hours going through her things, unpacking memories she hadn't opened about in months. Every planner, every framed photo, every token of obligations or reminders of hierarchical tasks told a story of endurance. Some items brought laughter, like small victories she had recorded in private. Others made her wince, the subtle humiliations, the constant expectation to justify herself. The notes she had taken to keep track of rules that weren't rules, but punishments disguised as guidance. Through it all, she began reclaiming agency over her life. She filled her calendar with things she chose, not things assigned. Slowly, routines that had once been dictated by fear became exercises of self-determination. Small rebellions became celebrations, finishing a project on her own terms, cooking a meal she actually wanted to eat, and allowing herself to take breaks without guilt. Each of these choices, seemingly minor, were milestones. Her academic work, which had suffered under the sorority's weight, started recovering. She reached out to professors she had been avoiding, not because she feared them, but because she needed guidance outside the toxic structure she had left. She discovered she could ask questions freely, submit work without fear of being criticized unfairly, and attend office hours without worrying she was being monitored or judged unfairly. Months passed, and eventually the sorority faced administrative review. It was slow, careful, and far quieter than anyone might expect. Claire's documentation exposed inconsistencies, subtle manipulations, and selective accountability. Leadership changes were enforced, and policies were updated. Mandatory ethics and anti-harassment training was introduced for members. Some of the house's tactics were never fully dismantled, but their infrastructure for silent cruelty had been pierced. The system had been held accountable, partially and imperfectly, but enough to protect future students. Claire's recovery wasn't instantaneous. Weeks passed when she would glance at her phone and brace herself for an incoming task that no longer existed. She would remember a procedure, a rule, or a fear, and feel momentary panic. But these reactions were manageable, temporary. Over time, they diminished as autonomy replaced coercion. By the end of the semester, Claire had moved into independent housing, found a routine that she controlled entirely, and reconnected with friends she had neglected for months. The girl, who had existed in perpetual tension, flinching at every expectation and apology, had returned in fragments. But this time, she was stronger, deliberate, and unapologetically present. By the following semester, Claire had flourished. She had rebuilt her life on her own terms. Every morning she followed a routine dictated not by obligation, but by choice. Her calendar contained classes she loved, projects that inspired her, friends she trusted, and small moments she deliberately carved out for rest. She moved through space without flinching, and she spoke without hesitation. The sorority house, the source of so much pain, had changed too. Leadership restructuring forced accountability, even if only temporarily. Policies were revised. Some of the more subtle, insidious forms of hierarchy were replaced with oversight. Some former leaders resigned quietly, replaced by others less adept at cruelty. But change in culture is always slower than change in policy. Claire didn't need to witness it. She didn't need to go back. She had rebuilt her ecosystem of safety outside the house. Graduation arrived faster than we thought possible. Claire walked across the stage with quiet dignity, carrying herself with deliberate calm. She had endured extreme pressure and systemic cruelty, and now she emerged as someone unbroken, capable, and autonomous. The satisfaction wasn't in revenge or punishment. It was in survival, resilience, and the subtle, undeniable truth that the system had failed. In the end, the lesson wasn't about confrontation. It was about endurance, strategy, and reclaiming identity. The victory was in living fully, not merely surviving. Claire had endured what few could imagine enduring, and she had emerged stronger. That quiet strength, forged through adversity, was more powerful than any hierarchy, any bully, or any house of rules ever could be.